They should have died in the cold, yet they didn't. No money, no shelter, no mercy from the Roman winter. So how did the poorest survive when everything was stacked against them? The real methods weren't heroic. They were something else entirely. Strange, clever, even a little unsettling. And once you hear what they did, you won't forget it. Let's start with this. When you're freezing your toga off in ancient Rome and can't afford firewood, you get creative fast. The poorest Romans turned public bathhouses into their personal heating systems. And honestly, their methods were borderline genius. Poor Romans couldn't afford the luxury of private heating or even basic firewood. While wealthy patricians lounged in their heated villas, the masses had to think outside the amphitheater. Public bathhouses became their salvation, but not just for getting clean. These places were heated survival pods for anyone smart enough to work the system. The Hypocost heating system was Rome's version of underfloor heating, with hot air flowing through walls and floors. Smart poor folks figured out exactly where the warmest spots were and camped there for hours. They'd press their bodies against heated walls, absorbing every bit of warmth like human sponges. Some would lie flat on the warm floors, pretending to rest between baths they couldn't actually afford. The really clever ones developed elaborate excuses to stay longer. They'd hover near the entrance, claiming to wait for a friend who was definitely coming any minute now. Others offered to clean the floors, scrub the walls, or run errands for bathhouse staff, basically trading labor for the right to not freeze to death. The attendants usually looked the other way because, frankly, free help was free help. These bathhouses accidentally became community centers during winter months. Friendships formed over shared shivering, gossip spread faster than the steam, and job opportunities were whispered between chattering teeth. Some poor Romans made their best connections not in the forum, but while huddled against a warm wall pretending to wait for someone. The atmosphere wasn't exactly spa-like, though. Steam mixed with sweat, smoke from the heating system, and the general aroma of too many unwashed bodies in close quarters. But when your alternative is literally freezing to death in a drafty apartment, suddenly that cocktail of smells becomes quite tolerable. But staying warm was only half the battle. They still needed to eat, and that's where things got really interesting. The Roman poor didn't just survive winter, they turned cheap ingredients into a science of staying alive. Their approach to food was pure practicality with a dash of desperation-fueled innovation. Legumes, onions, and barley became the holy trinity of poor Roman winter survival. These ingredients were cheap, filling, and perfect for the kind of cooking that kept you warm from the inside out. Forget fancy Roman banquets with exotic spices and roasted peacock. This was survival cuisine at its most brilliant. Stews and porridges were the weapons of choice because they served double duty, filling your belly and heating your core. A hot bowl of barley mush might not sound appetizing, but when you're one meal away from starvation, it's liquid gold. These dishes stayed warm longer than solid food, giving your body more time to absorb the heat and convert it into precious energy. Stale bread wasn't thrown away, it was transformed. Poor Romans would soak rock-hard loaves in whatever broth they could make, creating something that almost resembled a proper meal. The bread absorbed the liquid and provided bulk, while the warm broth made everything seem more substantial than it actually was. Garum, that fermented fish sauce Romans were obsessed with, became a lifesaver for the poor. Not because it was nutritious, but because it could mask the taste of ingredients that were, let's say, past their prime. When your meat is questionable and your vegetables are more brown than green, a splash of intensely flavored fish sauce can work miracles. Street vendors understood their market perfectly. They sold hot porridge and bean mash from portable stoves, targeting people who couldn't afford cooking fuel at home. The really desperate could even buy the burnt, crusty bottom layer from cooking pots, basically the char that stuck to the bottom. It wasn't pretty, but it was cheap protein that came preheated. Communal eating wasn't just about sharing costs, it was about shared body heat. Multiple people gathered around one pot meant everyone stayed warmer while eating. A full belly also meant better sleep and slightly more resistance to the cold, which could mean the difference between waking up the next morning or not. Of course, staying fed was meaningless if you couldn't stay covered, and poor Romans had some surprisingly clever solutions for that problem too. Romans mastered the sharing economy about 2,000 years before Uber existed, and their cloak rotation system would make modern timeshare companies jealous. Heavy wool cloaks were luxury items that most poor Romans couldn't afford individually, but collectively they could swing it. Groups of friends, neighbors, or even strangers would pool resources to buy one good cloak, then rotate it nightly. Each person got their turn for warmth, while the others made do with whatever scraps they could find. The system required trust. Steal someone's cloak at night, and you'd find yourself permanently frozen out of the arrangement. Quick pause here. If you're finding these survival methods as fascinating as I am, hit that subscribe button. These Romans had more tricks up their sleeves, and we've got plenty more ancient wisdom to uncover. Padding tunics became an art form of creative insulation. Poor Romans stuffed their clothing with whatever they could find. Linen scraps, dried grass, old rags, even leaves when desperate. Some used animal hair, not exactly comfortable, but effective. The goal was creating air pockets that would trap body heat, basically turning yourself into a human down jacket using whatever materials the streets provided. The really smart ones positioned themselves strategically around the city. Bakeries, tanneries, and metalworking forges all generated heat as byproducts of their work. Poor Romans would loiter nearby, pretending to wait for work or just looking interested in the craft. Business owners generally tolerated this as long as people didn't get in the way. It was an unspoken agreement that kept the peace. Shoe repair became a constant necessity and creative challenge. Broken footwear was patched with leftover leather scraps, tied together with rope, or stuffed with cloth. Some poor Romans walked around with feet wrapped in layers of fabric soaked in animal fat, not exactly waterproof, but better insulation than bare skin against frozen stone streets. Personal hygiene took a back seat to survival during winter months. Washing meant losing precious body heat, and clean clothes were a luxury when you only owned one set. The poor learned to prioritize staying alive over staying fresh, though this probably didn't help with the overall aroma situation in crowded spaces. But even the cleverest clothing tricks couldn't solve the biggest problem of all: where to actually sleep when you couldn't afford a decent roof over your head. Roman housing for the poor was basically a vertical nightmare, with the worst apartments perched at the top like frozen afterthoughts. The higher you climbed in an insula, the colder, draftier, and cheaper your lodging became. Gravity worked against the poor in more ways than one. Top-floor apartments were architectural punishment. Thin walls, gaps in construction, and minimal heating made these spaces only marginally better than sleeping outdoors. Landlords knew this and priced accordingly. If you could barely afford rent, you definitely couldn't afford warmth. Many poor Romans paid for shelter that was really just protection from direct wind and rain. Some gave up on indoor housing entirely and mastered the art of urban camping. Doorways became premium real estate during winter, offering wind protection and sometimes residual heat from the buildings they fronted. People would curl up under reed mats or crawl inside large baskets, anything that created a barrier between their bodies and the elements. Wine shops offered an interesting arrangement for the truly desperate. If you could scrape together enough coins for the cheapest, nastiest wine they sold, some proprietors would let you sleep inside once they closed. It was mutually beneficial. You got warmth and shelter, while they got a night watchman who was motivated to keep the place secure. Temples and tombs became makeshift hostels for the homeless. Temples provided wind-blocking structures and sometimes residual warmth from oil lamps or small fires. Tombs, oddly enough, were often built as solid structures that offered excellent protection from the elements. Some poor Romans regularly slept among the dead, which probably felt less creepy when your alternative was freezing to death outside. The truly resourceful built their own shelters from urban debris: straw piles, discarded fishing nets, torn sailcloth, anything that could be woven or stacked into a wind barrier. Some constructed nest-like structures in building corners using reeds and garbage, creating insulated pockets that were surprisingly effective at retaining body heat. Group sleeping wasn't just about companionship, it was strategic body heat management. Multiple people sharing space meant shared warmth, and arrangements were often carefully planned to put the most vulnerable, children, elderly, sick, in the center where they'd stay warmest. Speaking of protecting the vulnerable, Roman families developed some particularly clever methods for keeping their most fragile members alive through the bitter months. Roman children and elderly faced winter with all the vulnerability you'd expect, but their families developed survival strategies that were equal parts touching and desperate. Children often went shoeless through Roman winters, not by choice, but by necessity. Parents would wrap their kids' feet in cloth strips dipped in animal fat, a primitive but effective form of waterproofing and insulation. The fat created a barrier against moisture, while the cloth provided padding against rough streets. Kids learned to walk differently, avoiding puddles and sharp stones that could tear through their makeshift footwear. Parents gave children diluted wine or vinegar water during cold months, believing it would warm their blood from the inside. While the alcohol content was minimal, the warm liquid did provide temporary internal heating and probably made the kids feel better about their situation. It was medical theory based more on hope than science, but when proper medicine wasn't available, hope had to do. Family sleeping arrangements became military-precise logistics operations. Elderly members were positioned in the center of group sleeping areas, surrounded by younger family members who could generate and share body heat. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about keeping the most vulnerable alive through nights that regularly claimed lives. Multi-generational families pooled every resource they had to survive winter collectively. Grandparents shared their cloaks with grandchildren, creating intergenerational warming partnerships. Young adults worked during the day to earn money for food and fuel, while elderly family members managed the home fires and watched the children. It was a survival system that required everyone to contribute whatever they could. Neighbors developed informal support networks for the most vulnerable community members. People took turns checking on elderly widows and orphan children, sharing food when possible, and offering temporary shelter during the worst weather. These weren't formal charity organizations, just people understanding that community survival meant individual survival. Cold was the leading killer of infants and elderly during harsh Roman winters. Families reserved their precious fuel for heating small fires, specifically for the sick and very young, while healthy adults simply endured the cold. This triage approach to warmth allocation was brutal, but necessary when resources were limited and survival was uncertain. But individual family efforts could only go so far. Sometimes survival required help from larger institutions, and that's where Roman religious sites played an unexpectedly practical role. Roman temples weren't just places of worship. They were ancient Rome's version of social services, dispensing everything from bread to blankets alongside spiritual comfort. Temples sometimes distributed oil, bread, or cloth scraps to desperate community members, especially during harsh winter months. These weren't organized welfare programs as we'd recognize them today, but rather informal charity systems that developed around religious sites. Priests understood that helping people survive was part of their community responsibilities, and practical aid often accompanied spiritual guidance. Some poor Romans visited temples with purely material motivations, treating them as resource centers rather than sacred spaces. They'd arrive looking pious, but really hoping for a handout of food or cloth. The priests generally understood this dynamic and didn't seem particularly bothered by it. Keeping people alive was arguably more important than ensuring their theological sincerity. Shrines to household gods, called lares, often included public donation jars where community members could contribute surplus items for redistribution. These became informal community resource exchanges where people dropped off extra cloth, grain, or other supplies that others could take as needed. It was a crowdsourced charity with religious window dressing. Temples located near busy forums or marketplaces became particularly active charity distribution points during winter. Their high visibility and regular foot traffic made them natural centers for aid distribution. Priests would set up outside temple entrances with baskets of bread or bundles of cloth, creating impromptu help stations that served immediate community needs. Pagan priests occasionally organized more formal food or blanket distribution events, especially during religious festivals that emphasize community care. These distributions served dual purposes, providing practical aid while reinforcing the temple's role as a community cornerstone. People remembered which temples helped during their worst moments. Wealthy community members often donated surplus goods to temples, expecting divine favor in return for their generosity. This created a steady supply of resources that priests could redistribute to those in need. It was transactional spirituality that produced real material benefits for the poor. Those who received temple aid were often expected to return favors through labor, cleaning temple grounds, assisting with rituals, or helping distribute aid to others. This created a reciprocal system where charity recipients became part of the distribution network, ensuring the system sustained itself through community participation. Religion served a distinctly functional role in Roman survival strategy, providing not just spiritual comfort but tangible resources that meant the difference between life and death during brutal winters. These weren't just survival techniques, they were a complete social system built around the simple goal of not dying from cold. Roman ingenuity wasn't limited to engineering aqueducts and building roads. It extended to the most basic human need of staying alive through winter. The poorest Romans created networks of mutual aid, resource sharing, and community support that kept entire neighborhoods from freezing to death. Their methods were born from desperation, but refined through generations of experience, creating survival strategies that were remarkably effective given their limited resources. From bathhouse hustling to temple charity, these Romans proved that survival isn't just about individual cleverness. It's about building systems that work when everything else fails. They turned poverty into innovation and desperation into community strength. These same survival instincts would shape Roman society for centuries, creating the resilience that helped build an empire. If these Roman winter survival tactics fascinated you as much as they did me, make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into ancient history's most compelling stories. Next week, we're diving into one of history's most dramatic military confrontations, Caesar versus Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. It's a battle that changed everything, and the details will absolutely blow your mind.